A few days ago, I received a call from my mother. She told me it was her brother Brian's birthday while crying. She hadn't mentioned him in so long that I had forgotten all that had transpired, so I was taken aback when I heard that name. I told my friend this story, and he said that Reddit enjoys spooky government content. So here is the story of my family's sinister mystery. Before I tell you how I know, I'll tell you what I know. My Uncle Brian worked for a private company that had a contract with the U.S. government as a scrubber, retrieving or destroying top secret, and purported above secret material from sunken military boats was his or his team's responsibility. Documents, storage drives, cargo, weapons, dog tags or identification cards, and bodies were all included in this. In addition, he would remove country of origin signs, clean up identifying marks on ships, and salvage important components of the craft. These are the most intriguing and pertinent of his responsibilities, but they were not the only ones. Between 1969 and 1971, and again between 1980 and 1981, Brian engaged in deep-sea diving. Although nothing is known about his life between those two eras, we do know that he was assigned to a training facility in the Arctic Circle, most likely in Canada or Greenland. He was prohibited from engaging in a variety of strange activities at that time, and was only allowed to visit his home in Arizona for 6 weeks out of the year. He was not permitted to buy typewriters or office supplies. He was not permitted to spend money other than with a checkbook that his company provided. He was not permitted to enter a bank for any purpose. He was not permitted to handle cash. He was not permitted to attend big events or consume alcohol, etc. He was not even permitted to smoke cigarettes. With one exception, he was not allowed to write anything down. Thus, he would never touch a pencil. He was not permitted to touch a phone. No matter what time of day it was, Brian had to contact a phone number every 6 hours. To make the call, he would get up in the middle of the night, which usually annoyed his wife. Every time he made the call, he always talked informally, as though he were speaking to an old friend, and their exchanges were never more than pointless small talk. Only in hindsight did I discover that these calls were extensively coded, and I only heard them once in my life. We will never be able to know what he was truly saying. Brian refused to answer the phone, even when someone called for him. He would only touch it or talk if he dialed the number. Although I have never seen someone so paranoid in my life, I thought his actions were harmless and funny when I was younger. When I was 12 years old in 1999, my uncle vanished inexplicably. He was retired at the time I met him, and we had only met twice. Although I was too little to recall our first encounter, I made an effort to ignore him on our second meeting, and have done so up until this discussion with my mother. We spent a week with him in Phoenix, and he was always depressed. The man was extremely hostile and seemed to be only aware of his own innermost thoughts. He seemed to have completely departed this world and left a functioning body behind, since he was more contemplative and reclusive than anyone I had ever met. Even while he was sitting on the couch, he was constantly looking over his shoulder, and when my mom took us out to supper, he was continuously watching the rearview mirror. He would frequently do strange things, such as examine the light switches in his own house, unscrew the small plates, poke around, and then replace them. Every time he stepped outdoors, he peered up into the sky as though he was expecting a brick to land on his head or even a helicopter to take a picture of him. He was careful not to say anything that may land him in trouble, and he only ever spoke in short, stiff words. With a barrage of confessions just below his teeth, Brian appeared to be carrying the weight of the world. I tried to sleep every night, but I couldn't help but think about him. During that visit, Brian lost his temper one evening. He had a huge freak-out and began acting like he was high on drugs. I'm not sure what prompted it. He began yelling that he was sick of all the games and that he no longer wanted to be a gerbil during a typical talk on the couch. He lunged at me and attempted to strangle me, much to my mother's distress. He insisted on telling my mother that he would twist the head off show you all the circuits, and that he was always yelling about microphones in my ears and cameras in my eyes. He bit me, and he broke out of the episode and started crying when he noticed that I was bleeding. The house phone would not connect when my mom tried to call 911. A woman responded when she hastily dialed the number on his empty refrigerator. My mother informed her that Brian was acting strangely and that she required an ambulance and cops. The woman informed my mom that everyone should wait and that she would call Brian's doctor right away. I am a lifetime emetophobe and hospitals make me sick, so I declined to go to the hospital nonetheless. A man appeared at the door less than an hour later. He identified himself as Dr. S. The doctor had a clean shave and was wearing regular slacks and a button-down shirt. When he shook mine, I recall observing how coarse his hands were. Despite his size, he was too articulate to be a bruiser. The simplicity of his appearance and his serene manner gave me the impression that he was going to kill everyone in the home, Patrick Bateman style. I find it difficult to articulate what I mean, but the thing that sticks in my memory the most about him is that he smelled strongly of chemicals, like he had been varnishing wood or something. After speaking quietly with my uncle on the back patio, the doctor graciously excused himself and walked away. "Brian is going to be fine, he just needs a bit of rest," he assured my mother and me. "Tomorrow, you can pick up the prescription I ordered for him." The doctor simply smiled and answered, "Not anymore," in response to my mother's question about whether spending time alone with Brian was risky. I swear, after giving me a shoulder squeeze, he turned to leave. I was particularly troubled by two aspects of Dr. S's visit. The first was that the man only stayed for 4 minutes between saying hello and goodbye. How could he have spent that much time talking to Brian? Second, the doctor didn't get into a car when I hurried upstairs to see him leave. He literally left the neighborhood on foot. After seeing the doctor, Brian appeared to be feeling better right away. He joined us for supper and apologized to me. He seemed to be in a much better mood, as if all of his burdens had been lifted. That night, my mom and I slept in the guest room with the door shut because we didn't know what to anticipate from him. Like his priceless light switches, Brian could only be turned on or off. However, I woke up to my mother yelling in the middle of the night. Brian was gone, the patio door was ajar, and the house was dark. He didn't bring anything with him, including his watch, checkbook, or shoes. His keys were still on the counter, and his automobile was still in the garage. The line was terminated when we attempted to call the number displayed on the refrigerator. There was no dialing out on the phone. A group of men arrived at the house early the following morning. In addition to taking away all of Brian's belongings in boxes, they bombarded my mom and me with absurd, bizarre inquiries, such as, "Did Brian ever tell you his favorite color? What is his least favorite food? Does he get along with kids? Has he ever attended church? When did you first remember him? Did he have a right or left hand?" We were confused by the questioning. My mom was humiliated, but I was genuinely perplexed by everything. Regardless of her responses, they consistently expressed doubt, told her she must be mistaken, and provided some absurd justification. However, they didn't once question anything I said. I'm still not sure what all of that was about. My mother made the decision to sell her car over a year after the first shock of his departure subsided into a chronic ache. She discovered a VHS cassette hidden in the spare tire beneath the trunk floor. Brian sent it. While we were sleeping, he most likely left it there. Brian was standing someplace in the desert, in it. He appeared to have gone days without sleep and looked a few years younger. He told my mother about his line of work and some of the things he had witnessed and accomplished. Using this audio and a few exchanges between my mother and Brian's ex-wife, I put together all of the information I know about him. Since we discovered the tape, I haven't seen it, and I'm positive my mother destroyed it per Brian's instructions. The strangest and scariest things Dad discovered while working on sunken ships and submarines, however, are what I remember the most. Pressurized rooms that seemed to be occupied for weeks following the submarine sinking. There were loud pounding noises on the hull and in the passages, and some of the sailors seemed to have gone insane, writing all over the walls or killing one another. These wrecks were years or decades old, primarily from WI in the Cold War, with others from Vietnam. However, Brian claimed to have heard SOS in Morse code multiple times. He even says he heard the words "leave" once. The body of a young woman who seemed to have died much more recently than anybody else aboard the ship. Frozen bodies that appeared mummified, suspended in the air with smiles on their faces. The skin freezes and peels off, revealing a grin. When Brian discovered her, she looked like an angel in a flowing white garment. Even though she was imprisoned in a British submarine that sank in the 1940s and is now at the bottom of the North Sea, her skin was immaculate and not dried like the other remains. On Soviet ships, cages, chains, human experimentation, fetuses in bottles, remains that appeared to be both human and animal, vast prison networks in the Arctic's interior of one nuclear-class icebreaker, etc. According to Brian, he discovered a baby-like body floating in a lab, with limbs that were 2 to 3 feet long and dangling together like a dead wasp's. It disintegrated and dispersed in the water when he moved it. Brian described finding a passenger plane that had never been reported missing, but there were very few bones at all. It sank after colliding with the ocean. The bodies were still securely fastened to their seats. It was peculiar because the aircraft had sunk near to an old ship, and all of the bodies on the jet had dog tags that could be linked to the ship. My 12-year-old mind pictured the ship's corpses trudging across the seafloor and strapping themselves into the downed plane in the hopes of returning to their loved ones, even if it seemed like someone had pulled a practical joke by repositioning the dog tags. In the depths, scrubbers are losing their minds. A dive off the coast of Alaska claimed the lives of 2 of Brian's friends. One of them was discovered imprisoned inside a door that could only be locked from the outside of a chamber of the submarine they were investigating. He stated that a faceless woman had placed him there, and he was almost dying from hypothermia. The pressure difference caused the other to kill himself instantaneously after removing a small portion of his helmet. There are more, and I'll try to recall or ask my mother if anyone is interested. Strange individuals occasionally paid me a visit in the years following Brian's disappearance, always inquiring about Brian. They always asked me impromptu questions and found me in unexpected places. Despite never identifying themselves, they were consistently courteous. They found my mom and me wherever we went. In my senior year of high school, a substitute teacher once showed up to my biology class and did the usual lecture. However, at the conclusion of the day, he asked me if I had any relatives who were employed by the government and if I could recall my uncle's favorite color. The bartender kept attempting to offer me booze. I don't drink. When my then girlfriend/now fiance and I went to a bar for a friend's birthday in college. She then asked me if I would ever consider moving to Phoenix. He asked me if I had ever gone scuba diving and mentioned that his friend Brian used to live there. He mentioned my mother's entire name when he inquired about her health at the conclusion of the evening. Most recently, a man on a bicycle approached me as I was jogging on the woodland trail close to my California home and said I looked exactly like Brian, a man he had met in the Navy. The last I heard, he was out living in the desert or something, far away from the ocean, he remarked, referring to the fact that they had lost contact. He detested the sea. When I sarcastically responded that he most likely visited Phoenix, the man's face went completely blank. "That's right," he said. I have no doubt that he is happier there. The man then rode away. All of these individuals shared the trait of smelling like chemicals, much like Dr. S. At one point, Jill, Brian's ex-wife, informed me, "Your uncle had brain bubbles," and that the bizarre things he would say were caused by brain damage from diving. When combined with other work stressors, the combination of gases, pressure, and confined quarters can undoubtedly seriously impair one's mental health. However, Jill also worked for the government, which is how they first connected. She pretended that she hardly remembered Brian when he vanished. She seemed to want me to write him off as a crazy person. She also always smelled like chemicals now that I think about it. I struggled as a wave of terror swept through my chest, thinking that his fever would not go away. This was not like Matthew, who had always been a sickly kid. As I held his head, I saw that his neck was unusually stiff and his eyes seemed to have seen too much for a 5-year-old. It was the darned home. It was the living room. I took my phone out of my pocket so as not to wake Matthew. 11:45 p.m. By now, my spouse ought to have returned home. I felt a twinge of resentment at him for putting us through this. This was neither the place nor the time for confrontation, so I suppressed that thought. After all, he was on call, and if he hadn't shown there by 12:30 a.m., I would have called him. My spouse, a government physician, was assigned to a small village in Malaysia's Perak region. The government had provided all accommodations and expenditures, and his mission was only for a month. A week earlier, we had landed at an ancient yet dignified colonial bungalow from the 19th century. Directly across from the bungalow were the quarters of a nurse. On the day of arrival, I joked to my husband that if he hadn't returned home for the night, Matthew and I would have stayed with the nurses, because the house was too large for just the two of us, and it was also a little eerie, especially at night. In addition to the ancient rocking seat, there were lengthy hallways directly next to the living room that would disappear into the night. Bang! My memories were jolted back to reality by a flash of lightning. I heard the lights go out, with a horrible, yet familiar, click. If I could have cried, I would have. If I could have, Matthew and I would have fled the house. I forced myself to stay composed. I mean, wasn't I the family's logical one? Since moving would only make his situation worse, Matthew was in no condition to do so. When my husband got back, we could discuss switching to a new place to stay. It was only darkness, after all, and evil people were worse than any darkness. Hold on, did I catch a glimpse of the rocking rocker by the window moving? It isn't possible. I focused on the chair, silently wishing that it would stay still as I allowed my eyes to acclimate to the darkness. I was relieved to see that it was, in fact, still. I forced myself to stop being so paranoid, since it was not helping Matthew or myself. And when Matthew groaned, I started rocking back and forth in the hopes that the quiet would induce a deep, sound sleep. The hairs on my fingers stood on end almost instantly, and I was overcome with a sense of fear. Unwilling to confront whatever might be lurking in the room, I automatically closed my eyes. I didn't want to know if it was supernatural or not. Then Matthew started crying, though it sounded like they were coming from the level above. His sobs were unlike any I had ever heard. They were excruciating, almost exaggerated. They sounded like he was being tortured. Even worse, he had an unhuman voice, as though somebody were mocking the sound of a child. Without giving it any thought, I grabbed Matthew and sprinted wildly toward the nurses' quarters and the entrance. As if my life depended on it, I pounded on the reception door. I was led into the flats by a matron who opened the door almost instantly. She set up a room and requested that we sleep for the night without requesting an explanation. As I held Matthew and dozed off, I was too exhausted to object. Matthew was snoring when I woke up early. I gently touched his forehead and felt relieved that his fever had subsided. Before long, I heard my husband calling for us outside in the hallway. Since it was what we would do to each other in the end, I mentally prepared myself for the mockery and was ready to persuade him that I was not returning to that house. He consented to us living at a hotel for the duration of his placement in Perak, which shocked me, After we checked into the hotel, he promised to give me a rundown of what the matron had informed him about the important details. The matron gave me a pitying glance as we left the rooms, gave me a light squeeze on the arm, and then, without saying a word, went back to work. The matron said that a Potionic had haunted the residence. Women who had passed away during childbirth were known as Potionics. Their ghosts would stay in this world bitter and vindictive, wishing to be granted another opportunity to become mothers. Around 12 a.m. that night, the matron noticed a stunning woman brushing her hair while seated in a rocking chair by the old house's window. She was horrified when the woman took off her head, put it in her lap, and sneered at the matron as though she knew the matron had noticed her. Since the lights were off and the matron had no idea that I was in the house with Matthew, I did not hold her responsible for not saving me. Oh, and almost as an afterthought, the matron told my husband, a child's loud, close-by wailing was a dead giveaway that a Pontiac was around. Say upstairs if you could hear a youngster sobbing from a distance. It indicated that she was at your side. I prefer to think of myself as logical. Despite growing up as a Christian, I have never believed in ghosts, spirits, or paranormal activity, and I am now an atheist. I've tried, I promise, but I have no way of explaining what happened in the story I'm going to tell. Despite my continued skepticism, I have searched for and failed to find an explanation for what transpired at the farmhouse. I was told I should share this tale here, and it's real. The large, ancient farmhouse where my grandma lived was constructed probably between 1830 and 1850. It has some woods at the back and is encircled by fields and an orchard. The house is situated right in the center of the about 30-acre hay fields that make up the majority of the property. A long, straight driveway leads from the road to the front of the house before bending around to the back parking area. There is a group of trees that are said to house a cemetery, and the property gently rises up to a tiny hill in the back corner. My parents, who lived close by, inherited the property after my granny passed away when I was 7 or 8 years old. Since then, my family has rented out the house to a variety of strangers and grown hay in the fields. Even though we've always prevented it from deteriorating periods, it has also been uninhabited for extended periods of time. I was desperate to leave my parents' house the summer after high school, but I didn't have a good paid job. The farmhouse was much closer to the local community college than my parents' house, and I intended to attend there that year to earn some credits at a reasonable cost before transferring to a university. Even though we had taken care of the house since Grandma's death, including cleaning and minor repairs, my grandmother was a very poor interior decorator. Every room had almost a dozen layers of unsightly wallpaper placed over one another, along with lumpy banana yellow linoleum on the floor and olive green linoleum on the ceiling. I gathered some friends and made an agreement with my parents. We would rent the house from them for an absurdly low price in exchange for making some improvements while we were residing there, with my parents paying for any materials we would need, such as paint and drywall. Overall, it was an excellent deal because I've assisted with renovations before. Then events began to take place. We were still moving in when the first event happened. I had intended to do some work and meet up with a friend at their residence. Since I arrived early, I made the decision to take some of our roommates' boxes, which were all stacked in the kitchen, up to her room. I started moving boxes upstairs and was in her room when I heard a tremendous slamming/crashing noise coming from the back of the house downstairs. As if someone had been stomping extra dramatically across the house downstairs. I hear a few loud, but not as loud, thuds. I thought my friend was playing around and had come to help. I said, hello, or something, but nobody answered. Bewildered, I walked downstairs and looked all over the house for her, but it was deserted. I strolled out back, thinking she had gone back to her car, but I found the driveway vacant. Just then, I heard the house's front door bang. I waited for my friend to arrive on a swing in the yard because I was so frightened. We looked about the home to see if something big, like unstable boxes, had fallen over and made the noises, but we were unable to find anything, and the noises didn't seem loud enough for that. We had been living there for almost a month when the second event occurred. One of my housemates walked outdoors while I was at the house doing something I can't recall. After a few minutes, I heard the rear door slam loudly. We had a typical heavy wooden door on the rear of the house that led to a mud porch, a sort of enclosed porch where we stored the washer and dryer. But this door was strange. It featured a single swinging door at the end and two swinging doors with a little metal hook for a latch. Clear corrugated plastic sheets with the same opacity as frosted glass were used to window the entire structure, including the doors. I moved to the back door as soon as I heard the noise. I glanced around the corner and saw a massive, dark man standing outside the swinging doors. It was about 7 feet tall, with its head nearly touching the porch's roof. Everything appeared warped and stretched out like a shadow. I barely saw a little portion of it before it struck the doors from the opposite direction, causing yet another massive crash, and then it raced past all of the hazy glass in an impossible speed. I hurried outside after unlocking the doors. Inquiring about the sounds, my companion was sprinting back toward the home from the opposite direction. I made her stand on the other side of the doors and went back inside to see how distorted she appeared, since I thought she was playing a practical joke on me. I'd told my roommates about the first event, and we'd mocked about it a little. I could tell exactly what color her skin, hair, clothes, etc. were. I then had her stand away from the doors to check if she could have thrown a rock at them or something, or cast her shadow on them, but the sun was at the exact incorrect angle for her to do so. I finally told her what had truly transpired after questioning her for a long enough period of time. On the third occasion, there was more of a broad sense of malevolence than a specific event. One of my roommates, who worked the graveyard shift, had a rare night off, so we spent the evening watching movies in the living room. With all three of us sleeping in the living room, we entered a sort of slumber party mode as the early morning hours approached. I recall watching movies while sitting in the dark and frantically trying to block out the terrible feeling I had every time I glanced at the room's corner. The tiny area where our steps led to the higher level had a broken door, and I had the uneasy feeling that something was observing me from the shadows outside. Watching me and hating me, I remained silent and told myself that I was being ridiculous. Usually, I believe it's nonsense when folks on those paranormal investigative shows talk about bad feelings or negative energy. But I couldn't ignore this. I was overcome with fear that I couldn't describe, and I felt ill to my stomach and broke out in a cold sweat. My roommate, who typically works in graveyards, chose to spend the day sleeping at her parents' house at around 4 in the morning. She did this frequently because they lived closer to her place of employment and it was calmer and darker there. I mentioned that I might drive home because I didn't want to sleep there with whatever was behind the door, and I didn't really want to explain why. Although I never forgot about it, the creepiness of the encounter subsided with time as I drove home, despite the roommate who was remaining behind bugging me about it. I casually brought up the incident when my roommates and I were talking about the farmhouse and its strangeness a long time afterward. Before I could even elaborate, the friend who had stayed at the farmhouse that night freaked out and claimed to know exactly which night I was referring to. According to my other acquaintance, she too vividly recalled feeling as though something were standing behind the broken door, glaring at her, and, in her own words, directing an amazing amount of darkness and anger in her direction. We hadn't even spoken about the incident for over 6 months when we realized that we had all sensed the horror and hatred emanating from the stairway that night. There was another instance that was more just odd than eerie. We started exchanging ghost stories with my then boyfriend's best buddy, who was somewhat interested in paranormal studies. After some convincing, I gave him a tour of my creepy haunted farmhouse because he insisted on seeing it. Feeling foolish, I informed them that there had only been 2 actual incidents and that they most likely wouldn't witness anything. In any event, we organized and went to the residence. As dusk approached, I took the 6 or 7 of us on a tour of the main floor, top floor, basement, burial grove, and woods. At that moment, a friend of my boyfriend inquired whether there was an attic. I replied that there was, but that no one had gone up there in as long as I could remember because there was nothing there, and my mother insisted that it was full of spiders. A little rectangle in the ceiling of a closet that connected 2 bedrooms upstairs served as the attic's entrance. In the past, I had always avoided the attic because of the strong mental picture of spiders swarming out of the entrance and covering me. To enter the attic, you had to climb up and crouch on this ledge in the back of the closet and then lift away a board. However, we all went up after one of us had the courage to crawl through first. Nothing strange happened at first. We tried not to get off the rafters while exploring by the light of our cell phones. Everyone was shocked when someone discovered several old lengths of chain and dropped them. One of us eventually attracted attention to a pair of eyes that were reflected from the shadows on the opposite side of the attic. The light glinting back from the sclera in its eyes was all that was visible because our phones didn't have enough light to identify what it was. It appeared to be an animal, perhaps the size of a cat or possum. We thought it was probably a cat or some other little forest creature that had somehow gotten into the attic. We had nowhere to shoo it except down into the house, which seemed like a poor idea, and no one wanted to pick their way over the rafters toward it, in case it was rabid, violent, or anything else. It was suggested that someone with a camera snap a picture in the hopes that the flash would illuminate sufficiently to reveal what it was for the fleeting time. We weren't sure if any pictures would come out in the dark attic, but perhaps if we illuminated it for a moment we could see what it was. We discovered that this was also a horrible idea. Everyone was momentarily blinded. Fortunately, the image was sharp enough to reveal the corner where the unidentified beast was hiding. Strangely, there was nothing in the corner of the photo. There was no animal in sight, and the details of the wood beams and dust particles were clearly visible. As the camera was handed about in confusion so everyone could see the photo for themselves, we were able to lose it in the darkness after taking the picture. Even though the object was still sitting there, it was more of a, that was weird moment than a fearful one. Nevertheless, it is worth mentioning because this was the event that the largest number of people saw. Following this, there was a period of relative silence. Small things would occur like strange sounds, things that were gone and then returned, or fleeting views, but nothing like the big things as far as we were aware. More on that later. The next big event didn't occur until one evening while I was watching movies with a friend in our den, a tiny space off the living room. My friend got up to go cook popcorn while I was sleeping. I felt her return to her seat beside me, half sleeping, eyelids drooping. The couch sagged, and I felt a warm, firm leg brush against mine. I inquired, eyes still closed, how long she had left the popcorn in. When I opened my eyes after she didn't respond, I noticed that the couch beside me was vacant, with a depression that suggested someone was seated there, and no, the other person's leg was still palpable to me, touching me. My roommate was startled when I yelled and leapt off the couch, running into the kitchen. Both of us nervously lingered in the kitchen until our popcorn was done, and then we slipped back to discover that the sofa ghost butt depression had vanished and that everything was normal. These are the major things that I have personally experienced and that I find inexplicable. My roommate's mother, another friend, and a subsequent tenant have all shared further anecdotes. Some are humorous rather than frightening, such as the last 2 stories. Strange cats have been known to enter the chamber at the end of the corridor, only to discover it is empty. We've heard kids giggling, watched doors and rocking chairs move on their own, and heard strange noises that don't make sense. Some are as gloomy as the first 2, and the one that my friend's mother had may have been the most terrifying. It involved a black shape that resembled a creature at the door, and once drove her out of the house. The following year, my roommate returned to living with her parents while I moved out to attend a real school. Despite the fact that she and I are both atheists, the third roommate, who lived there alone for a while, talks about how she heard noises throughout the house and experienced a presence outside her bedroom door that was so ominous and hateful that she began sleeping with a Bible. One of the primary reasons she chose to move out was this. The space was empty for a while after she left. I haven't heard any more stories about the home since the following cats, although she did mention the same strange noises and missing cats that we had heard. My mom tells me that their dog sometimes looks and growls at things that no one else can see, but I don't know the current residents well enough to inquire about their well-being. Death will welcome you like an old friend when your time on this planet is over. Before you stand at its door, you cannot know if you would embrace it with fear, hatred, or acceptance. I cannot offer you reassurance that there is an eternal afterlife or tell you what will happen next. I can only assure you that you won't be alone when it occurs. Before Thursday, December 6th, 2007, I had never thought of myself as anything unusual. The best I could hope for as a teacher at the local high school was to help shape our future. I loved my job, even if it wasn't easy. Then, after returning home from marking a number of unsatisfactory essays on the evening of the 6th, I got a text message from an unknown number. It only included a time, a location, and a generic name that seemed somewhat familiar. Bride A, Lock Road 4, 5:34 a.m., Florence, Juliet. Any reasonable person would have concluded that the wrong person had received the communication. But as soon as I picked up the phone and saw the message, I had a chill run down my spine and was driven, for no apparent reason, to go check it out. The road itself was located in a dismal location with only deserted fields and abandoned farms, and was an hour's journey out of town. It would have been the ideal location to entice someone outside and murder them covertly. I was not concerned, in spite of this horrifying fact. I didn't know why, but I just felt sorry for anybody else could be there. I was unable to adequately describe the overwhelming sense of purpose that had taken hold of me. It was a strange concoction of persistent terror, grief, and sympathy. Everything in my life seemed to have built up to that point, and at that moment, being there was all that mattered. I hadn't slept a minute until Friday morning when I lay in bed waiting to see what would happen. I tried to slip out of bed as 4 a.m. approached, being cautious not to wake my sleeping wife, Anna. Since Anna, the lightest sleeper on the globe, could sense my thoughts and woke up because they were too loud, it was obviously a fruitless attempt. With her eyes closed, she said, "Alex, what's wrong?" I lied and said, "I just need to catch up on some papers. Nothing else is wrong. However, why would you believe that something is amiss?" She murmured, "You had a worried breath," although she was already falling back asleep. "Anna, everything is going great. See you after work, okay?" In answer, she muttered something unintelligible, and I walked out of the house. Our 5-year marriage had never involved secrets, but on that day, I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. My mind was racing with 1,000 questions throughout the hour-long drive to Lock Road. Who was the sender? What prompted me to take the chance of following the directions, or lack thereof, from such a mysterious communication? And why did Juliet Florence sound so familiar? Traveling through the dimly lit early skies was a gloomy experience. There was still a vivid blue to the sky, even if the sun had not yet broken the horizon. I saw something down the road as I approached my location. The car had overturned and collided with the ditch, crushing itself beneath its own weight. I pulled to a stop and hurried over to the wreck, already getting ready to call 911. From the car came a feeble voice that cried out for help. A woman sat in the driver's seat. imprisoned between the steering wheel, dashboard, and seat, a big chunk of metal sticking out of her chest. Since it was the only thing preventing her from bleeding out, the debris had embedded itself in the seat, making it impossible to remove. However, even doing so would have most likely killed her. I dialed an ambulance with trembling hands. Since we were essentially in the middle of nowhere, it would take the ambulance about 30 minutes to get there. This would be longer than the poor woman's remaining time. "It's really painful," she sobbed. The realization that she was going to die soon struck me with a sense of powerlessness. As the life left her body, all I could do was keep her company. She remarked, "I didn't anticipate it would be this way. I'm really afraid." I lied and said, "You'll be fine. Help is on the way." The bleeding worsened as she stretched out to try to remove the metal fragment stuck in her chest. "You must lie motionless." She continued to try to move in defiance of my orders, talking to herself incoherently. As we waited for assistance that would never arrive in time, I determined that my best course of action would be to keep her mind busy with easy inquiries. "What's your name?" "Juliet." What is yours exactly?" "My name is Alex. Why did you come out here in the first place?" "Alex?" She muttered incoherently, hardly audible. "Oh no, I'm sorry," before she began to faint. "Stay awake, Juliet, please." I uttered it loudly and deliberately, briefly waking her. She simply looked into my eyes in her final moments and said, "I'm sorry," in a whisper, for the second time. She stopped breathing after that, and all I could do was wait for the paramedics to come. After witnessing someone's life end so pointlessly and without warning, I felt empty and numb. When the emergency services arrived, they removed her lifeless body while the police questioned me briefly to find out what had happened. I couldn't figure out why she had seemed so familiar and why she had reacted so strangely when I told her my name. I went home instead of going to work. Anna, who had the day off, saw right away that I was strange. I sobbed as I told her about the mishap. Confused and terrified, I informed her that I had seen that terrible woman die and that there was nothing I could do to help. Not because she wouldn't believe me, but because something inside of me kept me from saying it out loud. I didn't tell her that a text message had instructed me to be there. She gave me a hug and attempted to reassure me that I had done everything in my power to support her and that at least she wasn't dying alone. Although it was a small detail, she might have simply vanished and rotted for days before anyone else traveled that lonely road if I hadn't been there. It ought to have ended there. After a few weeks, I gradually recovered from the shock. Then, one chilly January morning in 2008, I got another note as I was leaving for work. It had a name, Jeremy Brooks, a time, and a place. This time, the location was a nearby motel that was just 5 minutes away. Without wasting any time, I called for an ambulance and jumped into my car to go there on my own. I got there before the ambulance because I was much closer than the hospital. I hurried through the unlocked door of the apartment building and walked right in. A man I assumed to be Jeremy was sitting on the couch. He was as pale as a sheet and heavily bleeding from deep cuts on both of his forearms. It was evident that he had cut his own wrists and had just sat down to await his impending death. He had a terrified look on his face as he glanced up at me. He shouted, "Who are you?" as he collapsed, too weak from blood loss to support himself. I picked up a t-shirt off the ground and cinched it as securely as I could around his arm. It barely stopped bleeding even with 3 layers. "Don't do this, please. Remain with me," I said, searching for a better way to bandage his wound. There was not much I could do to help him, no matter how hard I tried. Despite his best efforts to sit up, Jeremy continued to sag due to his weakness. He was struck with the awareness that he wanted to live, and a light suddenly appeared in his eyes. He had a wish, but it was too late. "Help me, please," he said. "I'd rather not die." He was aware that whatever issue had brought him to this point, whatever had persuaded him that it would be best to abandon Earth, he was mistaken. However, I was unable to stop it, and by the time the ambulance came, I had witnessed the death of yet another individual. I would get 7 more texts over the course of the following month, complete with the name, time, and location of the signing. 7 people, alone and in agony, are condemned to die. I did everything I could to keep them from dying. I called the police, but since they had no proof that a terrible incident was imminent, they were powerless to do much. I then made an unsuccessful attempt to contact the dying. Nobody believed that I could give them insight into the future. I had long since made the decision to disregard them by the time they passed away and the 8th number showed up. If there was nothing I could do to help, why subject myself to the brutal truth of death? I had long since made the decision to disregard them by the time they passed, and the 8th number showed up of the dispersion she had pursued to represent man and woman. Strangely enough, I had turned off alerts, but the message still appeared to mock me at the worst possible moment. "What is this?" she inquired. The damage was already done when I swiftly grabbed the phone from her. "What message was it?" she reiterated adamantly. "Really, it's nothing. I lied badly and said it's just something from work." "Don't belittle me, Alex. You have been behaving strangely for weeks." My sporadic disappearances and my denial that anything had gone wrong were real. I was unable to conceal it any longer. The words I don't became stuck in my throat. I had 1,000 things on my mind. I was aware of how dubious everything appeared. Instead of asking me more questions, she simply held my hand and said, "Look, whatever is going on that you're too afraid to tell me, we'll get through it together." I was expecting to hear charges of adultery, a covert drug addiction, or worse. Someone knocked on the door while we stood there, and I started crying. The police were involved. Without hesitation, I followed them. I told my wife to call our lawyer, but even with his assistance, nobody was able to explain why I had been present when Juliet and 7 other people died. Hours passed while they interrogated me, and I had little responses. Even though I thought it was a rather strange circumstance, the most of the evidence suggested that I had been assisting the victims rather than murdering them. Although they ultimately released me, the investigation was still ongoing, and they could have come for me at any time. I had already missed the 8th victim's death when I got home. Whoever he was, he had passed away while I was questioning him. I sobbed and told my wife everything that happened. I needed her to know the truth if the investigation turned up evidence that was incorrectly used against me. I told her my story once we sat down. I recounted every single death I had seen and conveyed the utter despair that tormented me every single day. Even though it was an amazing story, she never once questioned the veracity of what I had spoken. She simply listened. She looked at me with tears welling up in her eyes as I concluded my conversation and had presented all the information on the table. "I'm so sorry, Alex," she said. That was it. No charges, no inquiries about the veracity of my account. Just unadulterated kindness. We continued to discuss our next steps, how I had handled witnessing all of these deaths and other topics throughout the night. Then Anna had an idea, as though a spark had been kindled between us. What if saving them isn't your job? I turned to face her, eagerly anticipating what she would say next. What are you saying? Why else would I be sent to them right before they die? What if all you're meant to do is stand by their side? Perhaps all you should do is offer them consolation as they go by. You've done everything you could to save them, but wouldn't they have perished on their own without you? I took a time to process what she had said. Though it was a nearly absurd notion, It brought me the deepest sense of tranquility. I felt happier and more hopeful than I had in the previous 2 months. She was correct. That feeling defied explanation, yet I knew it had to be real. I so waited calmly for the following communication, which would come shortly. It would also happen to be my next-door neighbor. Last year, an elderly woman whose name I hardly knew, but who I knew had lost her husband to cancer after a protracted and exhausting battle. Knowing full well that she would be dead in a few hours, I went to her tiny house, which was next to mine, and knocked on the door. I wished I had spent more time with her earlier, since she was a lonely woman who was just happy to have someone to talk to. She'd always been nice to me, asking about my job as I walked by in the mornings, and giving cake when she baked, but I'd always been too busy to notice. We simply spoke, and I didn't try to warn her of her impending doom. I simply paid close attention to everything she said as she related anecdotes about her husband. She grinned as the memories came flooding back, ones of a joyful, well-lived life. She began to feel fatigued as her time approached. When I returned, she had fallen asleep and would never wake up, even though I had offered to make her some tea. I saw a look of calm on her face, and I knew she hadn't been scared. She had been prepared, and I wished that she and her husband would be reunited in whatever afterlife existed. My curse became more of an ally after that. Seeing people in their final moments and providing them with consolation as they departed from this world was a duty I had to do. I took the necessary precautions and informed the police after every incident, but it was only an anonymous tip, enough to get them to the location, but not enough to raise suspicions. I just comforted them with a few words or held their hands. Most of them departed with a smile of acceptance, as if they believed my promises that everything would be all right. I attempted to get close to them before their last hour, whether it was only to start a polite discussion or to buy them a drink at the neighborhood bar. 10 years of assisting folks in quietly transitioning to the other side past, what I had formerly referred to as a curse had turned into a pleasant gift. Then, as Christmas arrived again in the latter part of the previous year, Anna and I were wrapping gifts for the celebrations and family feasts. I had been without a new name for about a month, but that was about to change when I got another mail that broke my heart with these straightforward words. 11:43 p.m. on Saturday, December 7. Anna Moore. I just gazed at the highlighted name on my phone, frozen in place. Anna spotted my lack of wrapping right away and snapped me out of it. She got another name? I nodded, and she understood without my having to say another word. My horrified expression spoke it all. "Oh, how long do I have?" she questioned simply, her normally upbeat voice becoming hollow and lifeless. I said we must go to the hospital, even though I knew there was no way to stop the deaths. She started to say, "Alex, don't," but I interrupted. "This can be stopped. It is not necessary for it to occur." She appeared strangely composed during our lengthy argument. She ultimately consented to have a checkup, if only to ease my anxiety. Naturally, the physicians were only able to perform the most basic tests on a woman who seemed to be in excellent health and not even coughing. Since most tests would take weeks to return, time we didn't have. Searching for anything significant was pointless. We were ultimately sent home without receiving a single response. What happens if we depart? What if we simply spent a few days away from the city? I recommended. She inquired, has anyone out of the 100 survived? I didn't have to state the answer out. She already knew it. Since the message didn't specify a location, it became clear that she would die wherever she was. We therefore made the decision to maximize our remaining time. Anna maintained her bravery in the days that followed, presenting a lovely front of delight and acceptance. We hugged each other for hours, looked at pictures, and reminisced about times long since past. I could hear her sobbing in the living room at night, afraid of what she would leave behind rather than what would happen next. Despite my best efforts to console her, There was resentment behind the surface of love and support. Pre-conception experiences. Please, please, delete all my encryptions and don't you ever send me another email. So in the future, my emails would be sent directly to me and I couldn't be successful in the overwhelming professional challenge. She was correct. One of the most lovely aspects of life has been taken away by me. Uncertainty is the problem. The knowledge that we are only here on Earth for a short time and that we could die at any time. I had taken away the element that makes us so tragically magnificent. She continued to love me in spite of this, and on her last day she vowed to never give up. After she passed away, there would be those who needed me. At the end of their lives, they would be alone themselves, and I couldn't disappoint them. It was getting close to midnight when her time arrived. We had both decided not to bring up her impending death. As on our first day, she requested if we might walk outside and take one last look at the night sky and share a kiss under the moonlight. However, it wasn't supposed to be. She abruptly fell to the ground as soon as she had gotten to her feet. The physician stated that my wife had experienced deep vein thrombosis. In essence, a clot had developed in her leg, broken off, and proceeded to her lungs, where it resulted in a pulmonary embolism. She was slain in a matter of seconds. Even after the death of my true love, the names kept flowing in. I was broken, despondent, and lacked the will to obey. Despite my desire to disregard the names, I had vowed to continue. As I came across fading names, I pursued them over the following 2 months. 5 victims who were spared from suffering in solitude. Every name I marked off my list stole a piece of my own soul away, even though I went up to them, made them feel at ease, and held their hand as they went by. I didn't have the energy to continue without Anna to help me. All I had to do was wait for the person in charge of my life to ultimately free me from my curse. So I did, until yesterday night, when I got a different message after all the others. There were no locations, no names, and no time this time. All I had to deal with was a harmless query. "Are you finished?" My thoughts were racing. The questions seemed so straightforward yet so overpowering. If I responded yes, what would happen? Would I be free at last? After giving it a lot of thought, I concluded that I had done my part and that it was time to let go and let life unfold as it was supposed to. I typed yes into the phone. I received a reaction in a split second. Who will be next? Then it came to me as though the last 10 years of my life suddenly made sense, at least in part. My first work, Juliet, had been more than just a chance demise. She had picked me to be her heir, launching me into a life that she had experienced firsthand. It was still unclear why she had picked me. Perhaps she chose me from a dusty phone book in her attic. Or perhaps we had known each other for a long time and the name remained after our first encounter. However, I had encountered the same predicament as her. I considered the ramifications of picking someone else to share my fate, but before I could come up with a name, another message appeared. Alex Moore, Hollow Street 7, Sunday, 8:49 p.m. I very well killed myself by leaving my work. I've already accepted that I don't have much time left, and I'm not attempting to avoid this fate. I still have a few days to take care of my business, but one question still stands. Here is some context. There are just about 5,000 people in the little town where I live. I've only been living here for the last 5 years while attending college, and I lead a somewhat boring life. I'm not sure where else to post, and it goes without saying that I've never actually experienced anything like this. I reside at the end of a dead-end street in a really tiny flat. Although I own a car, I typically walk to work. because fast food is only a 15-minute walk away, especially now that gas prices have increased. There has been one house I've had to pass every time I've lived here. A stunning, enormous red home can be seen just after turning onto a different road from my dead-end street. I think it's from the middle of the 20th century, although it might be earlier. It's red, a dark maroon, as I mentioned. Despite being old, the paneling has been well maintained. It has 2 floors, black shingles, and cream-colored siding, all the typical features of a tiny suburban town. It has a charm that I have always adored. A pretty large tree next to the driveway somewhat obscures the house itself, and the front of the home has a large porch. Nothing unusual, or so I believed. Every time I pass the house, I see an elderly woman seated on a wooden rocking chair on the porch. She constantly waved at me when I started my habit around 3 years ago, and she really seems like a wonderful person. Initially, out of courtesy, I developed the habit of waving back, but it soon became something I looked forward to. On the stroll, I frequently just listened to the sounds around me rather than listening to music. She would frequently say something to me, I believe hello, but I could never hear her well. On those days, I could hear the cracking of wood on wood. Naturally, I would always return the greeting. We finally spoke a few times, around a year ago, and I even walked on that side of the street, even though it required me to cross the street when I didn't have to. Even though she wouldn't say much in return, I enjoyed our conversations and the typical "nice weather today" exchanges. Looking back, I can't recall a single instance in which she wasn't out there. I hope she enjoyed it as much as I did. Although I still don't know her name, I could quickly identify her. Even in the summer, she wore a gray cardigan or shawl to stay warm, and her gray hair was constantly pulled back in a bun. About a week ago, things started to alter. I'm sick of living in a tiny, dirty apartment. I thought I should hunt for a real house now that I'm out of college and the local high school seems interested in hiring me. At least I have enough saved up. I've been watching the local real estate market for the past month in hopes of finding something that fits me, but it's currently somewhat empty. I saw it at that moment. 27 Fairview Lane is listed, a listing for her home. I was a little bummed that she was selling the property at first, but then I clicked on the listing. The home was demolished. The majority of the siding and trim had fallen off, the windows were boarded up, and the walls were dark and corroded. The tree was dead and withered, the grass was dry and brown, and a good chunk of the ceiling had fallen in. It was a completely different house than the one I had admired daily for years. I was initially terrified. I hurried out of my flat practically immediately because I was afraid anything had happened. I don't know what motivated me, but I was actually afraid for her. I ran down my street, rounded a bend, and came to a complete halt. The house had remained unchanged over the years, gorgeous and immaculately kept. Was I mistaken? I wondered if these were old photos. Without hesitation, I took my phone out of my pocket and started to view the advertisement. When I did, I saw that the pictures were time-stamped from the previous month. She was there when I turned around, rocking. As usual, however, things were different this time. Her smile, which had always been that of a gentle elderly woman, gradually widened when our eyes met, reaching the point where the corners of her lips nearly pressed against her eye sockets. She had also opened her eyes wide, and I could hear her giggling softly. She started shaking more violently and shooting back and forth so quickly that any normal person's neck would give out. She stopped after a second or two because the wood's creak was nearly loud. I blinked, I swear to God, and she was gone when I opened my eyes again. The house was once again a nightmare. I had seen them in the advertisements, savage and ominous. I spent several minutes standing there, astounded. That really frightened me because I've never been hit like a deer in headlights before. After a while, I simply returned home. I wanted to look into it more, but I had a feeling that horrible things would happen if I set foot on that place. I haven't had much sleep since. I see her every time I close my eyes. Her face, her smile was twisted. She rocked violently back and forth. Christ, like something from a scary film. In any case, I never saw her again after that. Walking by the abandoned shell of a house was part of my daily commute to work. I would search for anything related to the property in my spare time at work because, to be honest, I was too frightened to do it at home. I discovered yesterday the reason behind its appearance. The family never sold it, and I suppose it burned down in 2002. The police determined that the one fatality in that incident was suicide by arson. I believe I know who perished there, but I was unable to learn anything. I saw her again after learning this and making my way home, not at home, at the end of my street. She was standing. My heart stopped when I saw her and that hideous smile. I backed up to my apartment as quickly as I could and shut the windows and doors. In my sleep-deprived state, I was able to convince myself that I had dreamt it, but now I realize that I didn't. I know she's here now, which is why it was a fairly typical day and I didn't see her. I arrived home at 9 p.m., approximately 45 minutes ago. I could feel her eyes on me ever since I got home. With music playing in my headphones, I started writing this to try to make sense of it. I can hear her, though. I can fucking hear her because my left side is in the straight line with a window. She's currently outside my window. The laughing as she flies back and forth like a possessed toy. There's the creaking sound of ancient wood. I'm too terrified to look, but she's right there. The fourth floor is where I reside.